My name is Jonathan Ha, and as Gabe mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Red Pulse. So first off, I want to thank Beyond Blocks for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Very honored and happy to be here. The topic of my presentation is a new world of sharing economies, utilizing token economics. So what is a sharing economy exactly? The term immediately brings to mind ride-hailing services. Uber, Lyft, Didi in China. I think everyone uses these. In fact, I use them almost on a daily basis. Also, the ability to rent out on a short-term basis somebody else's home or apartment for a couple days or a week at a time. And also, as an individual, being able to earn a little bit of extra money by renting out your own space. Shared workspaces in a very convenient and efficient manner with like-minded people. WeWork is a very major player in this space as well. Now, somewhat interestingly, I think by now, there's been a sharing economy that has been attempted to be created for almost any product or service out there. And we have an interesting one here on the screen. And I think the sharing economy of umbrellas didn't seem to really work out too well for them, but still a very interesting idea nonetheless. But how do we define a sharing economy? The term has been so overly and loosely used over the past decade to have almost lost its meaning altogether. However, there are a few defining characteristics that help us to point out and identify which of these sharing economies are actually still abiding by the original vision that they started with, and which are not. First, an on-demand nature. Being able to call upon products or services at a point in time that you need them or want them. Second, an exchange of value. Having individuals be able to contribute into a system and get something back in return, whether that's monetary in nature or some other form of value. Third, scalability, of course. The ability to scale your user base as well as revenues while keeping your cost structure stable. Now this one's very important, utilization. The activation of underutilized assets and resources is oftentimes a very key component of sharing economies today. And of course, the peer-to-peer nature. Having individuals be a part of an overall ecosystem that are interacting with other individuals in a very decentralized fashion. And finally, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Feeling that you have ownership over the value that's being created in the ecosystem itself, as well as having shared ideas and values as part of that community. So taking a step back, the idea of a sharing economy is actually not new. In fact, if you go back many generations, in fact, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, when people used to live in small villages of perhaps no more than 50 to 100 people, the idea of sharing amongst the community was already very much in action. So people shared a water well, for example. People shared knowledge. So wisdom was handed down from generation to generation, villager to villager. People also shared protection, whether that was done via walls and other physical protections, or provided by people that were stronger than others in the village. There was a very strong sense of sharing already within the community. Now, as human civilization matured, and living arrangements have scaled very quickly from small villages to now metropolises with tens of millions of people as residents, people became less willing to share with their neighbors, essentially because these neighbors have become strangers. It was harder to trust their fellow neighbors, harder to share amongst a community of people that you don't trust, and sharing really wasn't in vogue any longer unless they received something immediately in return for their contributions. So much of the psychology, unfortunately, is very much a result of what we call the free rider problem. What is the free rider problem? So since people cannot be prevented from enjoying a common good, individuals may avoid contributing or paying in the hopes that others will continue to pay. So they're essentially free riding on the backs of everyone else. This problem prevents private organizations, those that are unable to levy a broad tax across the user base, from supplying these public goods. So as a result, they have turned to money in the traditional sense, fiat currency, in order to incentivize these actions that used to be done for free by community members. So it's starting to look a lot less like a sharing economy and much more like a transactional, conventional economy, where everyone behaves just in their own self-interest. So how do we get to this point? Well, we can take as an example a lot of the very well-known sharing economy platforms that we all are very familiar with today, and many of them I've put up on the screen here, including Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, WeWork, so on and so forth. Now, we can take a look at how each of these platforms score, to some extent, across these 6 defining characteristics that I've mentioned previously. So the first, taking a look at the on-demand aspect of these sharing economies, most of these platforms actually do score pretty well. And a quick word on this so-called scoring. Green check marks, of course, means that they still have and still retain a fair amount of that particular element. Red check mark, red cross mark actually, means that they haven't. And then a dash means somewhere in between, somewhere in the middle there. So back to the on-demand nature of things. We see that WeWork and Wikipedia, now pretty interestingly enough, never actually began with the idea of being on-demand. Yet we still think of them as sharing economies. Looking at the exchange of value, now Wikipedia again also does not necessarily contain that aspect of the sharing economy. Scalability. Now, interestingly enough, across the board, we see that Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, WeWork, all the way on down to eBay and peer-to-peer lending club all share the common characteristic of being scalable. Of course, being able to scale your user base, scale your revenues, while keeping your costs relatively stable. And for good reason, as we'll soon see. Fourth, and very importantly, this is one that I want to highlight, is the activation of underutilized assets and resources. Now, this is the underpinning of most of the sharing economy's value that was pitched initially to the world and to the people that use it. The ability to unlock a lot of the potential from these idle assets is what really attracted people to these sharing economies in the first place. And what's really interesting to note is that for a lot of these platforms, they no longer focus on that. You may be wondering, well, Uber, Lyft, don't they do that? You know, don't they have cars that people own and ultimately are activating now because they're driving other people around? Well, yes, but Uber also happens to be a financier of new automobiles, new autos for people that are interested in joining their network of drivers but don't have a car. Airbnb, they started out by allowing people to share their personal homes and apartments, perhaps just a room, maybe sometimes the entire apartment if they themselves happen to be out on holiday. But now a key trend is that many of the people that are sharing their so-called homes on Airbnb actually don't live there at all. In fact, a large proportion of those people have multiple properties listed on Airbnb. WeWork never began from the get-go as a means of sharing existing office space. They actually buy office space themselves and then lease that out to people. And the examples go on. In fact, the people that the platforms, I should say, that continue to have a strong element of activation of these idle assets include Upwork, Wikipedia, and eBay. So very much the minority in these cases. Fifth, the aspect of peer-to-peer, individuals interacting with other individuals, very important also for the decentralized aspect of sharing economies. The idea that incumbents perhaps have taken too much value out of the system and exact much too much control over the system is one of the key reasons why sharing economies were so attractive in the first place. And we still have quite a few of them still retaining that aspect of sharing economies, but certainly not across the board. And finally, the sense of community. Okay, so this is what a lot of these sharing economies and the platforms that have been built around them really try to play up in marketing, in promotions, in PR. And if you take a look at who actually is doing so in execution, very few. Wikipedia is perhaps the only one that has still retained the idea of a sense of community. And perhaps not so coincidentally, they're also the only one that is completely free to use. They're also the only one that has not taken $1 of venture capital or private equity money. Maybe not a coincidence, actually, and we'll get more into that in just a moment. Okay, so we've highlighted a couple key problems from the last slide. Now, I don't want to characterize all 6 of those characteristics as necessarily being important or even necessary for these sharing economies to retain, but what is problematic is that some of the key ones in the latter side of the slide are actually the underpinnings of what make a sharing economy actually useful. So I do want to highlight a few of these key problems that we are currently facing with these sharing economy platforms. So with a lot of these internet economies, there's this phenomenon of winner take all. You know, either you're the biggest player in the space or you're dead. There is no second place. Second place, third place, doesn't matter. Once you've reached scale, once you've achieved scale, nobody else can compete. Now, in order to get to this point where you have scale, where you are the top player, you are the winner, you oftentimes are forced to take VC money, right? How else do you get to the size that you need to be in order to wipe out the competition? Now, unfortunately, when you take VC money, it comes with some very strong and heavy strings attached, and part of that is a strong fixation on return on investment for your shareholders, of course. How do you continue generating ROI? How do you continue generating yields on those investments? Is to continue scaling. Even scaling beyond which the natural, perhaps steady state or whatever makes more sense for that platform to get to, above all other objectives. Second, now the idea of an activation of underutilized idle assets, essentially becoming asset light, which I think is now in vogue today, it no longer applies. And if you remember back to the slide previous to this, few, if any, platforms actually still abide by this governing, this really driving principle behind sharing economies, unfortunately. Third, rather than accruing value to the community and ecosystem, the people that are actually part of the ecosystem and contributing to the ecosystem, much of the value, if not all the value, actually is accruing to the platforms themselves. So you only need to look at the market valuations, the market caps of some of these top companies, publicly listed companies, to see this in action. Tens of billions of US dollars of value has been created, but not accrued to the community participants, not accrued to the individuals in the ecosystem, but to the centralized platforms themselves. Finally, although initially disruptive, these platforms have become massive incumbents in their own right. And they also enjoy massive amounts of regulatory arbitrage. So what is that exactly? Well, if you're Uber, your Airbnb, your Lyft, other massive platforms that now have an immense amount of capital to be able to deploy, they also have the capital to be able to hire an army of lawyers, an army of lobbyists, people to be able to act in their own best interests, circumventing oftentimes those regulations that are intended to safeguard consumers, those regulations that are intended to maintain a fair and competitive marketplace while competing against those platforms that they are intended to disrupt initially. You know, they talk a very good story. They want to be able to disrupt these incumbents, but in fact, they themselves have become incumbents. Very similar to the Animal Farm story, if you guys are familiar with that novel. And also leads to these smaller upstarts unable to be competitive. Now, what solutions are afforded by a token economy? Not to say that this is a panacea for all of these ills, for all of these problems, but very interestingly enough, it does actually hit upon a lot of those challenges and issues that I've just highlighted to you previously. So number one, summarized as, in order to survive, let alone thrive, you need to take VC money. Well, with token-enabled solutions, of course, you can do an ICO, okay? You can do a token sale. And by doing so, you're able to access capital in a much more efficient manner that doesn't have to go through another type of gatekeeper, which, as we all know, are the VC and PE funds. Number two, a transition towards being much too asset heavy is now very much in vogue, very much popular. Now, we can address this issue as well by reducing the need for scaling. Now, as I mentioned earlier, of course, everyone wants to scale their platform. You want more users on your platform because of the network effect. And with more users, the more value can be created and also extracted by all of the individuals on the platform itself. But so many of these sharing economy platforms have oftentimes scaled much beyond what they were intended to do. In fact, beyond the point where many of those defining characteristics now are no longer true. So how do we address this? Very similar to the VC-backed issue, as a byproduct, there is a fixation on scaling that can then be reduced and bring us back to the idea of being asset light, one of the driving reasons for why sharing economies were interesting in the first place. Third, value accrual to platforms. Essentially, incumbents that have been created that were originally intended to unseat, disrupt original incumbents, well, they're now the top players. Really nothing has changed. Perhaps the names of the incumbents have changed. Perhaps stock tickers have changed. Perhaps the person that runs these companies has changed, but generally speaking, nothing else has. Similar to the idea of a token sale where you can level the playing field in terms of being able to raise capital quickly and efficiently. No longer do you have to be bound by the very onerous terms that you would get from, if you're lucky, to raise a little bit of money from VC firms. And in terms of regulations, this is more of a work in progress, I would say. Once we do get more broad and consistent regulatory frameworks, not just within jurisdictions but across, then we'll get to the point where it will be a more fair and competitive playing field, especially for token sales. So drilling down a little bit further into the knowledge economy. So this is where Red Pulse, the company that I run, currently resides. We are a market intelligence platform focused on China that we've tokenized, where we're now compensating those individuals for their good ideas. There's a few things that we've observed. Now, if you chart out a couple key metrics here, at the left, the number of interested consumers in different types of knowledge. At the right, their willingness to pay. And then at the bottom there, the bottom x-axis, a spectrum going from the left side, general knowledge, to the right side, specialized knowledge. Now, if we map this out, as you might imagine, it's a normal curve distribution where the number of interested consumers for very broad, generalized market knowledge and information, of course, is quite high. Now, everyone wants to know the baseline. Everyone wants to know the most important things to know about markets today on a daily basis. Now, for specialized knowledge, the long tail, of course, the more niche, the more specialized you get, there's going to be fewer people that actually find that useful. And that's normal, that's okay. Now, interestingly enough, my own observation, our observations, has been that for the most part, we're moving towards a situation where people, financial institutions, corporates are not willing to pay for general knowledge. You get so much for free. You get free things from blogs, you get access to information from your own research team, you have access to magazines, you watch TV all the time, CNBC, Bloomberg, what have you, and so many of these things, so much of this information is already for free that people are used to not paying for things anymore. Not for things that are more general in nature, at least. Now, perhaps much more optimistically on the specialized knowledge side, the willingness to pay goes way up. The more niche, the more specialized you go, of course, the less you're able to access that. And that's represented by the much higher willingness to pay there. So to recap, the first observation that we've made regarding the knowledge industry is that financial institutions and corporates are no longer willing to pay for general market knowledge, but much more optimistically, these very same institutions are willing to pay for specialized, bespoke insights. And so this will come into play not only in terms of the sharing economy ideals that I've shared with you today, but also very specific to the space that RedPulse currently focuses on. And I'll tie those two together in just a moment. So the token-enabled sharing economy, if I could summarize what I just shared with you in one slide in how it works, we started out in villages, people living in groups of 50, maybe 100 people. They're participants, as we call them on this slide, and they're benefiting from common goods. So people that are able to contribute in ways that they have certain capabilities in, they go ahead and do so. And for others, they find some other way to contribute to the common good, while everyone gets the benefit from these common goods and services. Now, as you recall, once human civilization has scaled to the point where you have so many people, so many so-called neighbors, that you don't feel as comfortable. Maybe because you don't actually believe your neighbor's going to put in the same amount of contributions as you are, the free rider problem. Well, there's a tendency to no longer share. There's a tendency to only be willing to do things if you are being compensated directly and at that moment for what you've put in, becoming very transactional in nature, not really a sharing economy anymore. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If we're able to insert a utility token layer between the fiat layer and the common goods, well, we also have control over this opt-in ecosystem. You can define the characteristics of this self-contained economic system. For example, as part of the utility token layer, you can implement an inflation mechanism. Because these platforms, the companies that run these tokens, they also have control of the circulation, you can mint new tokens on a continuous basis, not having a fixed supply. This is just an example, by the way. So by not having a fixed supply and having this ongoing small amount of inflation that mints new tokens, that is a source of capital that you can then use to compensate those contributors to the common good. It's essentially a tax. As you may have caught earlier, many of these private organizations are unable to levy a tax broadly across their user base, and then leads to the free rider problem. But with this, you can. By minting new tokens, by implementing inflation, it essentially is a form of tax. And it's that tax revenue that can then be used to compensate and incentivize people to contribute to the common good, while at the same time providing benefit to everyone in the ecosystem. So that's also very similar to what we've done at RedPulse as part of our sharing economy. We start out with the RPX token, which we've launched late last year. We also have the RedPulse platform, which includes a research platform of voluntarily contributed content, as well as an expert network. Once we've achieved scale, having the ability to provide a platform through which financial institutions and corporates can request custom insights. Now, as you recall, custom insights that they are actually willing to pay for via our network and being connected and matched to the appropriate experts. And as you can see, research producers, research consumers are the key user demographics as part of this ecosystem. And on an ongoing basis, we are minting new tokens in a similar fashion as to what I just mentioned previously on an ongoing basis. What are these tokens used for? For a very good purpose, actually, because we're using these newly minted tokens, not putting it into our own pocket, but we're using it to compensate those research producers that continue to contribute value into the ecosystem. Of course, you can use the token to purchase premium publishing tools, perhaps alternative data sets, and while the open research platform is free to use, remember, most of these corporates and financial institutions are no longer willing to pay for general research, general knowledge. We do also provide premium services, perhaps real-time API access to our entire database, and they can pay for that using our token. Now, where it gets most interesting is that once we've scaled on both the research producer and research consumer side, we now have a new opportunity. The ability to provide a platform through which these financial institutions can pull request information rather than being pushed it. And that's a very important distinction, because when you are able to request the type of information that you need, oftentimes very specialized information, that's something that is revenue generative for us. And as a company, RedPulse takes a cut of that. We're also listed on several exchanges, providing liquidity to the overall ecosystem. So what are some key challenges and trends ahead, not just for Red Pulse, but for sharing economies in general, that are thinking about using tokens, thinking about creating a token economy, and bringing us back to the original ideals of a sharing economy? Number one, it is incredibly difficult to create a fair and transparent token economy framework. It's something that we continue to work on a daily basis. Having the right algorithms in place, having the right incentives in place, it's very naturally a classical economics problem. How do you create a framework, a set of policies that is not too obstructive, not too restrictive, but at the same time guides people, guides participants in a way that allows them to contribute positive elements into the ecosystem? Balancing decentralized, if it's completely decentralized, oftentimes can be chaotic, versus centralized. Now, everyone, I know that's sort of a bad word in this room, but centralized, having a single powerful authority, is also not something to be desired. But something in the middle probably is needed. Number two, reliance, perhaps over-reliance on semi-automated and often imprecise reputational scoring systems. Because once you scale and you try to remove at least some part of the centralized aspect, then you rely more and more on these algorithmic ways to score people, to rate people, and how accurate are they? You know, if the entire premise of your ecosystem relies upon this, you need to be really precise with these algorithms and continuously improve upon them. Third, of course, shifting crypto regulations across multiple jurisdictions, compliance frameworks, and this is a problem for all of us in this room. You know, how do you keep up with all of this? You build an ecosystem, you build a user base, all of a sudden they move the goalposts, right? They move the rules of the game. Very difficult to operate in. Fourth and finally, there we go. Incumbents and existing business models are pivoting towards token economies. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is more of the trends ahead part of the slide. And I think it's very exciting. You know, we have a panel that is talking about reverse ICOs, so to speak, and the idea that these incumbent players, and not necessarily dominant players, but these are players that have established themselves already, are now looking at tokenization as a potential business model pivot, as well as different path to fundraising. Really interesting stuff. So to conclude, at Red Pulse, we are implementing many of the ideas that I've shared with you today, and as a result, are creating the world's first sharing economy for knowledge. Thank you very much.
All right.
So
thanks, John.
For further reading, I just wanted to give a quick shout out. So a lot of the ideas that I've shared with you today is drawn from The Sharing Economy, a book by Arun Sundararajan, as well as What's Yours is Mine by Tom Slee. So if you're interested in more of these ideas that drive what really defines a sharing economy, how do we make it better, do check this out. And if you want to find out more about Red Pulse, take a look at our website, www.redpulse.com. Thanks very much.